In March of the year 1966, one of the most mysterious air disasters in history occurred in Japan. A Boeing aircraft was operating flight number 911. After taking off from Tokyo, it set course for Hong Kong, but began to disintegrate in the air just a few minutes into the flight. A minute later, it crashed onto the slopes of Mount Fuji. The investigation revealed that the aircraft entered a zone of extremely high turbulence. Among those on board the flight, no one survived. However, 5 lucky individuals returned their tickets at the last moment due to a delay. These were 2 producers, a director, a cameraman, and a production designer for the 5th film about the super agent James Bond. They missed the flight by chance, having lingered to watch a performance by the Ninja, an ancient Japanese organization of spies and saboteurs. Just a year later, the film You Only Live Twice was released, followed by 20 more pictures. The cumulative earnings of the Bond series in today's money amount to about $20 billion. The Bond franchise became more than just the main spy series in history. Direct references to Bond seem to be found everywhere. The special agent has long transcended the role of a film character. Over the years, he has become almost more influential than the British monarch Sherlock Holmes and the Beatles. But few know that The Adventures of 007, his backstory, image and drama, is a self-portrait of a real person, a British aristocrat, writer and genuine spy, Ian Fleming. In this video, you will learn how the personal drama of the author reflected on Agent 007, and how this agent changed the history of the entire 20th century. We will also consider Bond as a socio-political phenomenon, how Agent 007 explains the decline of the British Empire, the confrontation between the Soviet Union and the West, and feminism, how Bond movies influenced politics and constructed the image of the enemy, who profits from the endless franchise and how much, the crafty rules governing marketing within the Bond series, and finally, how the creator of the special agent worked as a spy in Moscow. The first Bond film hit the screens in October of the year 1962. According to the plot, the events took place in Jamaica, where a villain was diverting American missiles off course. The creators randomly chose this setting, but managed to tap into the most tense period in world history. Not even 2 weeks had passed since the premiere when the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted. Washington was threatening to invade Cuba. The USSR was preparing to launch missiles at the United States. The cinema earnings exceeded the budget by a factor of 54. At that moment, from behind the scenes of Hollywood, a gallant 50-year-old Briton was observing the success of Bond, Ian Lancaster Fleming. The namesake of the microbiologist Fleming who discovered penicillin was born in 1908 to the family of a Scottish banker and an English noblewoman in the very heart of London. His father became a member of the British Parliament from the Conservative Party by the age of 27. Fleming's mother was a socialite. Her grandfather was an advisor to another Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli. A close friend of the family was a young, promising politician whom you might have heard of somewhere. This was Winston Churchill. He and Fleming's father were assigned to the same elite hussar regiment. In short, the creator of Bond is a typical representative of old money, part of the cadre vanguard of the empire, which at the time occupied nearly a quarter of the world's land. From childhood, he was raised and educated as the master of this world. But then, the First World War began. Fleming's father was mobilized and sent with the regiment to France, where he was killed in May 1917 under German fire. His comrade Churchill miraculously survived and later wrote a heartfelt obituary for the Times. Fleming kept the newspaper clipping in memory of his father in his office until the end of his life. When his father died, young Fleming was 9 years old, attending a preparatory class and preparing to enter Eton College, the most prestigious in the country. A quarter of British prime ministers over the past 300 years have walked its halls. But there was a hitch. When his father's will was opened, it turned out that he left his widow and 4 sons about £19 million. Even today, and especially at that time, it was a huge sum. Unsurprisingly, with such a cushion, Fleming's studies at Eton did not go well. However, he began life truly luxuriously. By the age of 18, he already had about a dozen girlfriends and as many instances of reckless driving. A year later, he received a white ticket. He was found to have gonorrhea and was discharged. But his mother did not give up hope of making him a respectable person. She tried to place him in the British government, then in journalism, and then in a bank. In 1933, Fleming even went to Moscow on behalf of Reuters to cover the trial of British engineers from the Vickers Company. They were suspected of espionage and sabotage. Fleming raised a stir back home. Under this pressure, the British authorities even imposed sanctions against Moscow, a trade embargo. In the end, everything ended well. The engineers were released and sent back to England, and the embargo was lifted. One small detail: while the Englishmen from Vickers were being tried, counterintelligence overlooked a self-taught spy. In Moscow, Fleming was carefully gathering data on the lifelines of the country. The 25-year-old aristocrat grew so bold that he even requested an interview with Stalin himself, just in case he was lucky. He didn't know what response he would get. "But can you imagine?" they responded. Allegedly, Stalin himself wrote to him in the spirit of, "Comrade Fleming, please excuse me, I have no free time, perhaps another time." With his intelligence, Fleming went to the British Foreign Office, an initiative taker, as they used to say. The report was appreciated, and the young man was remembered. 6 years later, when Europe once again stood on the brink of war, Fleming returned to Moscow. Formally as a correspondent for The Times, but in reality with a quite specific assignment from the centre. The spy was to find out where the troops were stationed, what equipment they had, and what the sentiments among the officers were. We do not know how successful this operation was, but even if it was all in vain, it's important to understand that engaging in such activities in the USSR was mortally dangerous. After that, the caring mother arranged for her son to work this time at the Admiralty, under the department to which the naval intelligence belonged. Initially, it was a probationary period, but with the onset of World War II, it became permanent. Thus, the future author of the Bond series entered the Secret Service of His Majesty King George VI. In intelligence, Fleming became the chief creative officer. His journalistic experience and innate adventurism were of assistance. However, working as an idea generator for secret operations was only half the job. It's also essential to be able to defend them before the authorities. Surely you have heard of the Enigma, the German cipher machine. Alan Turing, the father of the computer age, tried for years to unravel its mechanism. The English had plenty of trophy machines. What they lacked were the codes themselves. The future author of the Bond series came up with a way to get them, albeit in a small way. 5 sturdy fellows, German uniforms, and a German plane. They needed to simulate a crash over the English Channel and send an SOS signal. When a German ship came to the rescue, the plan was to kill the entire crew and seize it along with the cipher book. The plan was called Operation Ruthlessness. In its drama and impact, it's practically a ready scene from a James Bond movie. However, in reality, the operation drowned in endless approvals and was never launched. But Fleming did not give up. The year 1943. The Allies had driven the Germans out of Africa. The question arose of a landing across the Mediterranean, from Tunisia to Sicily. Here, Fleming brought one of his old ideas to life. Find the body of a vagrant, dress it in an officer's uniform, attach it to a suitcase with fake papers, and dispose of it off the coast of Spain, which was not participating in the war but was sympathetic to the Germans. It also sounds like a scene from a spy thriller, but this one materialized into reality. The Spaniards indeed retrieved the corpse and, after long persuasion, showed the contents of the suitcase to the Germans. All the leadership in Berlin was in shock. The documents plainly stated that the Allies were preparing a landing in Greece. Hitler, without much thought, quickly transferred an entire army there. Fleming's plan worked brilliantly. While the Nazis were in Greece, the British and Americans landed in Sicily. The operation was called Operation Mincemeat. A couple of years ago, a film about it was even released. In his free time from sabotage, Fleming attended Allied conferences. During one of those meetings, he ended up in Jamaica, then a British colony. He liked the island so much that he told a colleague, "You'll see when this damned war is over, I'll live here, I'll swim, write books, and simply enjoy life." Said and done. After the victory over Hitler, Fleming bought himself a cottage in Jamaica 2 years later, which he named GoldenEye, in honor of the first major operation entrusted to him in intelligence. Every year, Fleming moved to the estate for the winter. During one such visit, in early 1952, he finally settled down to write a spy novel. He was already 43 then. For the first book, Fleming latched onto a personal story. In the spring of 1941, on their way back from the States, he and his superior stopped in a town in Portugal to play in the casino there. And there they encountered Duško Popov, a triple agent of Yugoslav, German and British intelligence, a lover of drinking, women and the high life. So during the game, right in front of Fleming's eyes, Popov bluffed. He wagered $1 million and forced his opponent to fold. Naturally, he was playing with money that wasn't his own. It was German money. This episode formed the basis of the first book about the special agent, which Fleming titled Casino Royale. Regarding the name of the main character, the Brit pondered it for a long time. It had to be something as simple and dull as befits an undercover agent. And one day, he was struck by an idea. The answer had been right under his nose all along, quite literally. The author of his bedside book, A Guide to the Birds of the West Indies, which was apparently his sleeping aid. The author of this book was American ornithologist James Bond. The story of Agent 007 began. As Fleming himself admitted, he started writing to cope with stress. Firstly, a new family. His mistress, the wife of a parliamentarian, became pregnant. To avoid a scandal, she had to urgently divorce and then marry Fleming. And this marriage was not particularly happy for either of them. The spouses brazenly had affairs with others. Moreover, his wife with none other than the leader of the British opposition, who advocated for détente and decolonization of the empire. This particularly infuriated Fleming. And here's the second reason for his stress: the collapse of the British Empire. In the year 1952, the British lost India. They left Jordan and Palestine. Africa was ablaze. But the biggest loss was, of course, Egypt and Sudan. In 1956, the new authorities in Egypt took away from the British and French a key asset in international trade logistics, the Suez Canal. Besides Israel, no one supported the British. Even the USSR and the USA turned out to be allies on this issue. Britain could not recover from such a blow. Winston Churchill fiercely tried to preserve the empire during his second term, but Britain, along with its Prime Minister, was fading and losing its grasp. While the Germans bombed London, the States helped the British as if on credit. And after the war, the Marshall Plan came into effect. Under it, the country received $45 billion from the USA for reconstruction on the condition of repaying wartime debts. Now imagine a cocktail, not vodka martini, something stronger. Pour into a shaker the bruising of national pride. Add a regime of austerity and rationing, then a portion of nostalgia. In the end, for sharpness, add a touch of fatigue and helplessness. Shake, but do not stir under any circumstances. Call this cocktail resentment. So after the Second World War, where Britain seemingly was among the victors, the whole country became hooked on this cocktail, especially the aristocrats, the masters of life for whom even the whole world was not enough. Just imagine yourself in Fleming's place. You grow up in a superpower over which the sun never sets. You inherit millions and think you will live calmly and happily, just like all your ancestors. But suddenly, the frantic first half of the 20th century arrives, and all hopes for a peaceful life vanish before your eyes. Perhaps that is why Fleming began to build his universe. A universe constructed by an escapist, a person who strives to create a fictional heroic world instead of a rather bleak reality, where there are many beautiful women and cars. Partners from across the ocean do not dictate what to do. That is why, in Bond's universe, America is not an elder brother. The relations between the two powers are quite egalitarian. When needed, America helps. When necessary, it quietly steps aside. While the British super agent saves the world, all the while, everything is pointedly polite. There is no rivalry. CIA agent Felix Leiter is a good friend of Bond. They met in the very first novel. There he lent Bond a substantial sum of money with which Bond outplayed and destroyed Le Chiffre. The hint was caught across the ocean. Within a year, Casino Royale was aired on American TV as an episode of a series. Jimmy Bond was an American there, and Felix Leiter was British. For Fleming, this was excellent publicity. The first book sold 5,000 copies, each new novel built on the last. 30, 50, 100,000. But this was not enough. The real boost, if not a kick, could only come from Hollywood. In 1960, Fleming started from scratch writing the screenplay for the film Thunderball. He enlisted 2 screenwriters for help. As it turned out, it was in vain. Later, he would have a long legal battle with them over the rights to the plot and characters. Therefore, the film would not be released until 5 years later. Thunderball received an Oscar for visual effects, one of only 5 across the entire Bond series. A good third of the film consists of underwater scenes, which, by the way, still look quite decent today. In one such scene, Agent 007 examines the underside of the villain's yacht and then hides from his henchmen. Fleming was inspired for this episode by quite a grim story. In 1956, shortly before the Suez Crisis, Khrushchev visited Britain, not by plane or liner but aboard a new cruiser, naturally to show Britain its place. Without hesitation, British intelligence sent its best diver to study the ship. He went on the mission and disappeared. Only a year later did local fishermen find his body, without a head and arms. He was identified by his clothing and a scar on his leg. What happened to him in the depths remains unknown to this day. The archives on this case will be fully disclosed in the year 2057. Everywhere you look in the Bond series, there are traces of intelligence services and spies, but not only them. While Fleming was locked in litigation with the screenwriters, Hollywood producer Harry Saltzman approached him. Behind him was a dozen films, and notably military service in the Psychological Warfare Division. Essentially, during the war, Saltzman dealt with propaganda. In that division, leaflets, films and radio programs were prepared aimed at demoralizing the enemy. But the influence of professional propagandists does not end there. Screenwriter Richard Maybaum, who wrote 13 Bond movies, was also a seasoned propagandist. Throughout the years of World War II, he crafted uplifting films and edited newsreels. He ended the war with the rank of lieutenant colonel in the US Army. He then wrote and produced a spy thriller with a simple title, OSS, Office of Strategic Services, the Future CIA. What does this indicate? The film franchise about the main special agent of modern times was literally created by employees of Western intelligence services. We do not know whether this was assigned to them as part of their duty, or if it was their own initiative, but it is a fact. Just as it is true that many creators of the Bond series had a military background. For their generation, not being involved in military service was unusual. Even the second producer of the Bond series, Albert Broccoli, served 4 years in the Navy during the war. Together with Saltzman, they sought funding, assembled the team, and the process was slow. But then came a breakthrough. In March of 1961, Life magazine interviewed President Kennedy. When asked to name his top 10 favorite books, he included From Russia with Love by Fleming. Overnight, Fleming went from being merely a well-known writer to the author, read by the most influential person on the planet. Work on the film heated up. Within a year, while Fleming was writing another book at his villa, filming for Dr. No was taking place right next door. After the premiere, when Saltzman and Broccoli realized the gem they had in their hands, they set to adapt From Russia with Love, Fleming's most famous book at that time. And again, luck was on their side. The earnings surpassed the budget by almost 40 times. In England, the second film was released in October 1963, in America 6 months later. But President Kennedy didn't want to wait until the spring of 1964. He immediately ordered a copy of the film based on his favorite book to the White House, and wasn't mistaken. Over the course of a month, he watched the film several times. His last viewing was arranged 2 days before his trip to Dallas, from which the president did not return. The creator of James Bond outlived Kennedy by a short time. Ian Fleming died in August 1964. He was let down by his heart. He was only 56. He did not live to see the premiere of the next film by a month. It was Goldfinger, a film that set the standard for Bond movies and spy thrillers as a whole. It was after Goldfinger that Time magazine would write that Bond had become the main hero of 1960s mass culture. And Sean Connery secretly came to resent Bond out of fear of being typecast by this cinematic image. Let's understand the origins of Agent 007. Actually, any kind of biography was given to him precisely by Sean Connery. Fleming initially didn't bother with it. James was just a functional character, a blind government weapon. But the actor impressed him so much that in the next book, the writer made Bond Scottish. The father of Agent 007, Andrew Bond, was from a noble family. His mother was from Sweden. She met her future husband while he was travelling through Europe as a sales representative for the company Vickers. Yes, indeed, the same company whose engineers were tried in Moscow in reality. James Bond himself was born in Zurich. When he was 11 years old, his parents died while climbing the Alps. Slightly older than Fleming himself was when his father passed away. Well, you see, Bond is a literary clone of Fleming himself. A favourite technique of many authors who write main or, less commonly, secondary characters based on themselves. Just as much an adventurer and free thinker. He didn't complete his studies at Eton, lost his virginity at 16, and joined intelligence at the onset of World War II. According to the books, Agent 007 is a tall brunette with determined cheekbones, around 30 years old. Over 60 years in official Bond films, the role of Agent 007 has been portrayed by 6 actors. Sean Connery, 6 films. George Lazenby, 1 film. Roger Moore, 7 films. Timothy Dalton, 2 films. Pierce Brosnan, 4 films. Daniel Craig, already 5 films. Now about the origins of the actors. All facets of the British Empire are represented. 2 Englishmen, a Scotsman, a Welshman, an Irishman, and even an Australian. On average, actors assumed the role of Agent 007 at the age of 38 and left it at 46. The very first Bond, the legendary Sean Connery. When he was cast, he was 31 years old. At that time, he was an ordinary Scottish labourer. He started as a milkman and then was a bodybuilder and model. Fleming, being an infamous snob, as you might understand, was initially shocked by the producer's choice. But when he saw him on screen, he was thrilled. Connery's Bond was cunning and ruthless, yet ironic, a wild, charismatic figure. The dashing Mr. Jarboe succeeded Connery. By then he was quite weary of the role. One small snag. The Australian Lazenby had no film experience, only commercials, but at the casting he managed to get into a fight with a security guard, which greatly surprised the producers. He was just the kind of person they were looking for. It must be explained here. The late 60s was swinging London, the summer of love, and the first youth subcultures. Simple guys were in vogue. Warren Beatty or Michael Caine, as straightforward as a stick. Lazenby played just like that, despite having one of the franchise's most tragic stories. The only film where Bond marries, only for his spouse to be immediately killed. Lazenby left after the first film. You'll be surprised, he feared ruining his career. After Lazenby, the Bond universe changed. Richard Nixon became President of the United States, who, according to some rumors, had visited the Soviet Union as a child, and he quite quickly began a policy of détente, a reduction of mutual tension in relations between Washington and Moscow. Villains were replaced by local scoundrels, Caribbean dictators and Swedish millionaires. The West itself was experiencing a rise in feminism. In such conditions, the super macho agent was something of an anachronism. That's why the third Bond, portrayed by Roger Moore, differed so greatly from the previous 2. Films with him in the role were quirky and light-hearted. Instead of geopolitics, the franchise creators decided to explore the realm of culture. Moore was succeeded by Timothy Dalton. Calm, cynical, with a weary sparkle in his eyes, a romantic of the high road. In the films with Dalton from the late 1980s, Bond's promiscuity was consciously downplayed. This was a response to the extremely relevant issue at the time of the fight against HIV. In the early 1980s, the incidence rate in the West was increasing exponentially. By 1983, it was already being discussed as an epidemic and subsequently as the HIV pandemic. In the summer of 1985, immediately after the release of the last film with Moore, the disease reached Hollywood. Rock Hudson was the first movie star to reveal his diagnosis, and he deteriorated literally within a few months. At that time, knowledge about HIV was so limited that he, while ill, was even denied boarding a flight from Paris to Los Angeles after unsuccessful therapy. However, audiences didn't particularly warm to Dalton's portrayal of Bond. The producers miscalculated. Compared to other heroes of that era, which was still overtly masculine, like Schwarzenegger, Van Damme and Stallone, Dalton's refined manner seemed odd. The public wasn't ready for this, and the box office receipts understandably declined. Ultimately, Dalton lasted just a couple of films. The fifth Bond was Pierce Brosnan, the Bond of the millennial generation. His 007 marked a return to the Connery era. Charismatic, sarcastic, ultra-stylish, but behind the trademark smirk was concealed confidence and ruthlessness. A true hawk. The end of the Cold War heavily influenced the plots of all the films with Brosnan. Sometimes Soviet weapons ended up in the wrong hands, sometimes a media mogul would want to pit the West against China instead of the Soviets. Occasionally, villains meddled with Azerbaijani oil, or a North Korean general plotted to seize South Korea. Unlike the early films where villains aimed to drive a wedge between the West and the Union. But more on that later. Finally, the sixth Bond, Daniel Craig. An updated version of masculinity, impersonal and powerful, all according to Fleming's commandments. A blind instrument of the authorities, one who works with fists, not words. Craig's era came during the post-September 11 world, confused and unstable. Over the last 5 films, the creators have diverged so much from the plot templates that the franchise can be viewed as a series within a series. Over 60 years, Bonds have changed significantly, but Agent 007 possesses one detail that permeates all his personas. It is the psychology of a lone wolf who knows exactly what and how to do best. He doesn't need advice or help. He doesn't need a large team of like-minded individuals. For psychologists, Bond is an archetypal and vivid example of the so-called dark triad. First, there's narcissism, meaning pride and a lack of empathy. Second, Machiavellianism. Bond is a manipulator willing to disregard morality to achieve his goals. Finally, there's psychopathy, which so attracts us in movies, meaning cold-bloodedness and ruthlessness. If you abstract from Bond's charming face, you'll find that before you is a maniac, granted a license to kill by the authorities of a powerful country without trial or inquiry. What makes us believe Bond is a good character? Perhaps it is time to reconsider our views on the image of the agent and finally, stop romanticizing it. The Italian writer and cultural theorist Umberto Eco is considered a key figure in the scholarly view of the Bond series in the West. Eco deconstructed Fleming's novels into parts and identified about 12 semantic pairs, for example, love and death, advice and the Western world, idealism and greed. We will not list them all here, but we'll focus on the key ones. Bond and the villain and the woman and Bond. Together they form a structure that drives the plot forward. When we say Bond girl, we typically refer to the super agent's sexual partners, Playboy cover girls in bikinis from a magazine first published the same year Fleming's first book came out. In almost every book, Bond's girls are quite the Marilyn Monroe type, blonde, blue-eyed, voluptuous, around 25 years old. Not very similar to Fleming's wife, nor to his literary muse and lover, Blanche Blackwell. The prototype for Bond's girls was Muriel Wright, slim, strong, yet unassuming and simple. She and Fleming began dating when she was 26. A few years later, Wright died in a German bombing raid. Fleming never healed this emotional wound and began replicating the romantic image from book to book. Throughout the entire film franchise, Bond has had 57 partners, just over 2 girls per film. Roger Moore holds the record, with Bond having 4 lovers in the movie A View to a Kill. Bond's youngest lover was 21 and the oldest was 50, but that was Monica Bellucci. The women in the Bond series can be divided into 3 main archetypes that have not changed since the 1960s. The first type, victims. They appear at the beginning of the film, help Bond as much as they can, and die in the middle, preferably right in his arms. The most famous example is Jill Masterson, covered in gold paint in Goldfinger. The archetype of the perpetual adventure seeker or opportunist. The second type is more interesting. The girl is supposed to work for the villain, capture Bond, fall under his spell, and then die. The more original, the better. Helga Brandt, for instance, died in a pool of piranhas. The most famous femme fatale in the Bond series, Vesper Lynd, also dies in the water. According to the books, Bond's first and greatest love combines all archetypes: sexual partner, treacherous betrayer, victim, and companion. This is the third and main archetype in the entire franchise. An ally who knows her worth and does not immediately succumb to Bond's charms. Let's trace how and why this image changed. Starting from the 60s, the era of the sexual revolution and the second wave of feminism. Bond girls were independent, self-assured, fearless characters. Women of Bond in the 70s, instead of heiresses, kept women and self-employed, are now all scientists or special agents. Holly Goodhead from Moonraker is both. The subjectivity of women was growing. They were no longer just assistants with a pretty face. Their actions directly influenced the story. In the film from the year 1981, one of the main plot lines is the heroine's quest for revenge for her father's death, when she finds the killer and mercilessly pierces him with a crossbow. Already by the beginning of the 1990s, activists were not fighting for the adoption of specific laws. They declared war on gender stereotypes, particularly in mass culture. In the first film of the 1990s, when the new ethics were still a long way off and sexual motifs even in family comedies were pervasive, a woman was quite literally placed above Agent 007. The role of the head of British intelligence went to Judi Dench. In the same film, an ordinary Russian IT specialist, Natalia Semyonova, effectively does Bond's job by destroying the killer satellite. In the era of Craig, Bond's polygamy completely broke down. With his partner in Quantum of Solace, there was nothing. And in the last two films, Bond has only one woman with whom he also has a child. Over 60 years, the female characters of the franchise have changed dramatically. In general, along with the women themselves, their attitudes towards power, men and themselves, have also transformed. But the villains of the Bond series underwent an even more serious transformation. When Umberto Eco analysed the Bond books, he managed to sketch a composite of the typical franchise villain. Most often, this was an unexpectedly wealthy simpleton with peculiar quirks, often quite deadly. He invariably had a flaw in character or appearance and hailed from Central and Eastern Europe, Slavic countries, or the Mediterranean. In the films, things are somewhat different. First, motivation. For 4, it's revenge. 10 simply want to make money through arms sales, banned substances, and so on. Or recall Goldfinger, who wanted to detonate a dirty bomb at Fort Knox to inflate the value of his gold reserves. The remaining 11 villains just sow chaos. They aim to pit superpowers against each other, cleanse the earth of what they consider superfluous people, or even just capture South Korea using the North's hands. Furthermore, whom Bond's opponents work for. 8 villains, or 1 in 3, work for the International Spectre Organization, terrorists and extortionists. Contrary to popular belief, in only one film does Bond's main enemy act directly in the interests of the Soviet KGB. Like in Fleming's works, almost every villain is either a psychopath, of which there are 8, or disabled, with 10 of them fitting this description. It's not enough for the bad guy to plot something evil. He should preferably look the part as well. Physical flaws are often visible right on the face, such as burns, scars, or, at best, a pirate eye patch. The most interesting aspect is the origin. Out of all 25 villains, only 5 are originally from the USSR. But that's in the films. With Fleming, it's quite the opposite. In the Bond books, which comprise 12 novels and 8 short stories, a clear pattern emerges. 2/3 of the villains act on orders from the Kremlin. Sometimes these are real intelligence agencies like the GRU and KGB, but more often they're mysterious entities. One must recall the circumstances under which Agent 007 appeared. Remember, we talked about the twilight of the British Empire. Here's another detail. When Fleming sat down to write his first book, the country was engulfed in a grand scandal. The British intelligence services had uncovered a group of double agents. the Cambridge Five. Intelligence officers and diplomats had been spying for Moscow for 15 years. The blow to the Crown's reputation was colossal. Naturally, one cannot forget about Senator McCarthy across the ocean, the chief American fighter against communism in Hollywood, or the case of the Rosenberg couple. They were then tried for passing American nuclear secrets to Moscow and sentenced to the electric chair. These were the same years, even months. The atmosphere was very characteristic. 10 years later, the situation changed. For a time, the Soviet Union no longer seemed like an existential threat to the West. The true fear was instilled by those who wanted to disrupt this delicate balance of power, namely terrorists and extortionists. They became the new antagonists in the Bond series. Remember, Fleming had a legal battle with the screenwriters of Thunderball over the rights to the story. It was at their suggestion that Blofeld and his organization Spectre appeared in the Bond series, the special executive for counterintelligence, terrorism, revenge, and extortion. A ring with an octopus was their distinguishing mark. The film franchise producers seized on the idea. For Fleming, the Soviet Union was an enemy with a capital E. Film producers rather quickly abandoned this geopolitical conflict and invented new foes. Two simple examples. A film from the year 1977. The first, where only the title was derived from Fleming's book. The screenplay was written from scratch. Bond and a Soviet intelligence officer fought side by side against a villain who wanted to destroy people on land and create an underwater civilization. The film ended with a bedroom scene, the curtain falls, a reaction to the Helsinki Accords of 1975, the peak of détente between the Union and the West. The second moment is when, in A View to a Kill, Bond was presented with the Order of Lenin, just like Kim Philby, the leader of the same Cambridge Five. The Order of Lenin was the highest award in the USSR. The content of Bond films could be used to gauge when relations between the USSR and the West were improving and when they were deteriorating. At the end of the 1970s, another crisis occurred against the backdrop of missile deployments. It was precisely then that the script for Octopussy was being prepared. In the first version, a Soviet general not only wanted to seize Western Europe, but initially tried to stage a coup and kill Brezhnev. Bond would have arrived in Moscow on a supersonic aircraft to save him. This plot element was ultimately cut. So why don't ostensibly anti-Soviet films paint the Union in entirely black terms? We have no evidence that anyone told producers that Soviet heroes should be good today and bad tomorrow. It's simple. The first and probably key reason for such sharp changes in tone is money. Anti-communist films rarely did well at the box office. The general audience needed something universal, a force that eternally wants evil and eternally commits evil. Not the KGB or the Chinese, but tricksters threatening to blow up the chessboard on which superpowers divide spheres of influence. Reason number two, believe it or not, once again, money. Producers Saltzman and Broccoli dreamed of showcasing their films in the Soviet bloc countries. It was a vast market, with hundreds of millions of new viewers. Few people enjoy watching movies where the main villains are representatives of their own country. In this sense, Hollywood was always quite rational. Unfortunately, during the Cold War, not a single film from the franchise was officially released in the USSR. Naturally, video rentals were overflowing with films featuring the adventures of Agent 007. And when GoldenEye was shown in Russia in January 1996, it immediately topped the box office. It was nothing personal, just business. And most importantly, how the Bond series managed to earn significant money. Scientists from Finland completed a vast study. They examined nearly 70,000 companies, 1 out of every 8 in the country, and explored the reasons for their successes and failures. Ultimately, experts devised a universal rule that applies to any business in any industry. It goes like this. When starting a business, high profitability is more important than explosive growth. If you want to be successful, you must greatly exceed expenses and create a buffer from profits. With a competent approach, this will provide room for maneuver and future growth for years to come. The Bond series followed exactly such a path. The early films generated profits 40 times the production costs, then 10, then 7, and now about 5 times. None of the 25 films failed at the box office. Until the end of the 1990s, the most expensive Bond film was Moonraker. The story there is delightful. After the success of Star Wars, producers decided to send Bond into space. Everything was prepared hastily, with plans to shoot a different story altogether. A rough plot, insane script devices, endless repetitions. The budget inflated twice over, while earnings remained at the same level. Producers never made such mistakes again. But how not to depend on the box office market? Very simply, find another source of income. For the last 30 years, each film pays for itself even before hitting the screens. According to marketers, over 60 years, Bond has earned approximately $7 billion from brand contracts. Let's conduct a mental experiment. You can break down real brands existing in the market like Sherlock Holmes, Harry Potter, or Star Wars. But even if you've seen a couple of Bond films, you remember that Agent 007 drives an Aston Martin with a Rolex on his wrist. Since the 1960s, the volume of product placements has increased on average from 5 to 30 brands per film. But which brands did Bond showcase on the screen most often? The third place is shared by irreconcilable Swiss rivals. Luxury watch brands, Rolex and Omega, each featured in 9 films. Moreover, Rolex appeared in the early films, while their competitors from Omega secured their place in the franchise from the 1990s. The second place in the brand race is shared by 2 incompatible products. The silver Aston Martin and Smirnoff vodka, each appearing in 12 films. Finally, Bond's undisputed favourite is Bollinger Champagne, featured in 15 films. 2/3 of the Bond series are infused with references to this brand. True masters of native advertising that you don't want to skip. And it's not just a couple of sips on the screen, it's an entire PR campaign. This is precisely what drives the Bond franchise. The filmmakers don't even think about marketing. Half of the work is done by sponsors, and for them, such campaigns are a ticket to the world of premium brands. But where did this premium nature come from? The same Fleming made an effort. An Eton graduate and lover of the good life found the best way, in his opinion, to convey the hero's image. Through what he eats, what he drinks, how and where he dresses, what he drives. Bond inherited all these dozens of brands from Fleming, for whom such a lifestyle was not just boastfulness, it was a status and a reflection of longing for a vanishing world. Now the Bond franchise is awaiting another reboot, perhaps the most significant in its history. The last film put a definitive end to the Craig era, and what to do next is not entirely clear. According to statistics, every second person in the world has watched at least one Bond movie. That's 4 billion people. It is rumoured that during previous times, work in the spy agency and clever gadgets was seriously studied based on the films of the franchise. Fleming's nephew wrote in his memoirs that President Kennedy consulted his uncle on how to originally and effectively stage a coup in Cuba and eliminate Castro. The image of the spy as a superhero saboteur has firmly taken root in the public consciousness. In the postmodern era, the image of Bond was rethought several times. Think of the parodies about Austin Powers or Johnny English. There were also serious works, such as the Kingsman franchise. In recent films, Bond is no longer just a knight without fear, reproach and empathy. He still serves as a weapon in the hands of the British government, but now he is a man who loves one woman and his child, and he cannot imagine life without them. I consider you a sexist, a misogynist and a dinosaur, a relic of the Cold War. With these words, Judi Dench's character greeted Bond in the 1995 film. Bond emerged as a byproduct of the Cold War. He grew gills and swam unflinchingly in the ocean of geopolitics for 40 years. But after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the hero didn't go anywhere. History did not end. New challenges appeared with which Agent 007, sometimes playfully, sometimes reluctantly, but copes. If Bond is indeed someone's relic, then it is only of the British Empire. James Bond is the most British Britain one can imagine. In the 1974 film, there is a vivid metaphor. The British intelligence headquarters in Hong Kong is on board the semi-submerged liner Queen Elizabeth. For 30 years, it was the largest and most luxurious ship in the world. In the age of jet planes, the steamship became obsolete. Eventually, it was simply out of use. First, it was bought by an American hoping to convert it into a hotel. Then he changed his mind and sold it to a Chinese magnate for a floating university. While being transported to Hong Kong, a fire broke out on the ship and it was run aground. 3 years later, the ship was dismantled for scrap. In the fate of this liner, one can discern the British Empire, which failed to adapt to new realities. For the entire British aristocracy, and for Fleming in particular, it was a resounding slap in the face. Fleming died just short of the moment of resurgence. Not geopolitical, that much is clear, but cultural. The Beatles and Queen, the English Premier League and the Mini Cooper, the Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. And this entire pyramid is held on the sturdy shoulders of an Atlas in a sharp tuxedo.